Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in a complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host, founder of TrueMark and the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And today our article is Strengthening Manufacturing Supply Chains for a New Industrial Era, where we'll be unpacking how to develop more resilient and sustainable supply chains through innovative financing. And today, I'm absolutely thrilled to say that my guest is Jamie Rusby, former sustainability lead at VELUX and IKEA, and now founder of Generation One. Jamie, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time this morning.
Great to be here, Charlie, and thanks for the invitation. And thanks also for all that great work you do on the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Extremely important work.
Oh, Jamie, don't normally get a glowing endorsement of what we're doing during the opening gambit. So that's very kind of you to say. Thank you very much. Jamie, explain to us, please, what on earth Generation One is and the work that you're doing. I think our listeners and viewers will immediately be intrigued by your roles at VELUX and IKEA, obviously some Goliaths, but really fascinated to hear what you're now doing at Generation One.
Yeah, great. Well, Generation One is around a year old, and I founded it together with my business partners, Willem and Saskia. And we exist to close the gap between corporate commitments on climate and action on the ground. And the way we do that, what we work with is decarbonization as a service. So this is a full service, including the planning part, the financing part, the delivery and the reporting, focus on consumer goods brands and manufacturers. And we've all in our careers focused a lot on supply chain decarbonization and also getting investment into the global south on these topics. So we understand all the barriers that are there. So the solution we bring is got three parts. It's making the planning part more efficient. So the manufacturers can work to identify decarbonization solutions, and the brands can work with their suppliers in a more portfolio structure. And these are some AI tools behind that. Then we have probably the most important part, the implementation part, so actually getting new technologies into factories. And we have energy service companies in Bangladesh and Nepal who are active with both the equipment installation, but also the whole process around that and the maintenance. And then thirdly, the finance part. So we have a 20 million euro investment fund called the ORE Investment Fund attached to us, and that is enabling affordable finance solutions to make this happen in reality. So we've got going so far. We've focused on rooftop solar for manufacturers, and we've installed 10 megawatts in around 40 projects in Nepal and Bangladesh.
Amazing, Jamie. Amazing, Jamie. And just to give us like some real clarity around, what does a typical client of Generation One look like? I mean, you mentioned those projects, but what are the types of organizations that you're working with at the moment? Yeah,
so partly given our geography in Bangladesh, the fashion sector is so important there. And we worked with fashion manufacturers. So these are manufacturers making ready-made garments, to sell to brands. So we have a client that is actually the manufacturers in the supply chain of the large fashion brands. Okay. At the same time, what we've understood and realized is that to enable those manufacturers to be able to move and start decarbonizing is super important to have the brands with them and with us on this journey. So the brands are sitting at the top of the pile, you could say, and they are the ones who have a full view of the value chain. They can bring people together. They can bring organizations together. So having the brands involved is extremely important in the process. So you could say we have two customers. One is the manufacturers in Bangladesh and in other geographies, and it's the fashion brands, the large, fashion brands working multinationally.
It's fascinating and sort of alludes to or titillates what we're going to be discussing today in terms of the article that we're going to be going through. But just, I think our listeners and viewers who presumably will be checking out your LinkedIn profile as we speak, which we'll provide links to, will be fascinated to sort of peer into the experience of somebody who was working in such large companies, on their sustainability strategies and implementations, and now working in the kind of the startup world.
So it's a completely different world in the startup world, where it's around, creating momentum, being self-driven, and bringing two people together in this kind of ecosystem to deliver what you're setting out to do. So I would recommend it. I mean, it's not for the faint-hearted, but I would recommend it to anyone who wants to, a learning curve to just increase exponentially.
I love that. And I'm intrigued to know sort of, you get a lot of obviously founders and entrepreneurs who perhaps don't have the kind of background and experience that you have of working in those large corporates. Now that you're on the other side of the fence, what would be the advice that you would offer with your sort of previous career in working with large corporates to startup founders in the sustainability purpose space? What would be your number one piece of advice to them be that you think that they perhaps aren't aware of, considering your previous experience?
I must say it is extremely helpful having been in the corporate world when now speaking to corporates around their problems. And they're so hard to navigate these big organizations from the outside. So I think one of the things I hear a lot from speaking to founders is they say, well, I spoke to this person in this department and they said they were super interested, and now it's just, it's all go from here. And of course, having a bit of perspective of being in these organizations, you realize just how many decision centers there are in these organizations, and needing to be, really nimble in trying to find, the right way in, the right value proposition for the right person or department you're speaking to, because there will be a different case with, depending on which function you sit in. So I think it's not an easy one sitting on the outside, having not been there. But I think that's probably the piece of advice. Treat it like you're speaking to many different companies when you approach a large corporation, and then, really tailor what you're bringing to that specific company or function.
I'm with you. That's such a useful piece of advice. I imagine there's lots of, purpose-driven founders listening in at the moment who are thinking, yeah, we get, it's so exciting, isn't it? When you're a startup and you get person X from company Y who has some seniority in their position going, I want to talk to you. Even having the conversation, then the conversation goes well and they give you that encouragement and you think, oh my God, we're in with so-and-so. And then that's the naivety that comes through in what you're saying. You need to think, no, who else needs to be part of the ultimate decision-making process for us to actually move from interest to getting something over the line? Is that a fair synopsis?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where the founders have the superpower, right? Because they're resilient, they have that perseverance. So I think it's, they have that strength behind them.
Very good, very good. Well, I myself am taking big old note on that one, Jamie. So thank you for providing that gold in the first 5 minutes or so. Now, I'm again sure that our listeners and viewers are sitting here thinking this very eloquent, very, very, very capable chap is sitting on the podcast speaking to Charlie with this amazing sort of experience in your career to date. But what's inspired you to do what you've done so far in your career? Can you take us back to just some experience that you can recall that has really shaped your view of the world and ultimately led you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, this is almost not a choice to work with what I work with. It's what I have always done through my career and what I will always do. So it sits pretty deep, and that was the way I was brought up. I grew up in a small village in the countryside in England, and my parents had practiced sustainable living before it was called that. We grew our vegetables, we ate plant-based diets, we didn't consume a lot. We were pretty free range, me and my siblings, kind of out there in the woods as our playground. So I think it sits pretty deep there, and the journey I've been on is really to go from rather like a skeptical position around the role of business in the sustainability challenges to the position I am now, where I understand that business needs to be central to solving these challenges. And there are many formative moments in my career, but I think one that I'll point out that's really shaped my view on how to work in this space as a sustainability leader from IKEA. I joined IKEA around 2012. We're putting in place a new strategy for sustainability, and one of the big goals in the strategy was to achieve 100% more sustainable sources for the wood that goes into IKEA products.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big one because it's around 0.6% of all the commercially harvested wood in the world goes into IKEA products. So it's a potentially enormous positive impact you can have if you work with those volumes. And the discussion at the time was, can we set a goal for 100% of the wood to come from more sustainable sources, and by that meaning FSC certified or recycled. There's a huge amount of discussion, and from the people who work with forestry, they're out there in the world sourcing materials, talking to forest owners, and they said this is just simply not possible given the volumes that we have. And the lesson I learned then was there's very few things that are actually impossible. It's rather the things are the way they are today because a group of people have decided it should be so, and then we've worked in that way for many years, and it's become a habit. So I think having that mindset that these decisions have been put in place because people have decided them to be so, and they can just as easily be change course when we have new context, new information, and unraveled. So 8 years later, then IKEA was celebrating reaching 100% on that milestone, and that was a real lesson to me. And sustainability leaders every day will come up against this to say that's just not possible with the way we do things. That's not that's going to affect this and that, and it's largely because people are sitting in their day-to-day realities, and it's always been done in that way. And we know if we're going to make the changes we need to do things in a different way. So that mindset that there are very few things that are impossible or can't be changed, and to bring that into whatever I do.
And that coming back to your point about the experience that you've had so far of running Generation 1, there's a lot of commonality in that same attitude of starting a business, starting a startup, having to have that resilience and drive to say, no, this is achievable, and this is how committed we're going to be to delivering this particular outcome. And perhaps how that same resilience of thought is needed when thinking about challenging the status quo around sustainability within larger organizations, larger, more sophisticated supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a fair comparison to draw?
Absolutely. I think having worked in this space for a number of years, there's a degree of frustration, and I think that frustration is also now channeled into determination that I have. So I used to describe myself as frustrated but optimistic, but now I describe myself as determined. And the reason I'm determined is because actually, if we take supply chain decarbonization, for example, there are strong business cases to decarbonize. There is money available, but this is actually what we're talking about. It's more of an orchestration problem. So it's getting the capital to the right places. It's with the right strategic and technical expertise. It's around creating a way of collaborating between parties in a value chain. So these are not insurmountable barriers, but they're real barriers because we got used to a way of working that we need to change. But I'm determined because I see that this is solvable, and that that's really the idea behind Generation 1.
And you're using the term determination, or to be determined to resolve some of these issues. There's a sense of the will, that there needs to be the will, collective will in the room to change. And ultimately we're human beings. We love the status quo. We don't like change. We don't want to engage with it. Out of interest, just on the 2012 IKEA example, I'd love to know if you can recall any particular turning points or any particular kind of, propositions that you put together that switched the dial from this is not possible to this is not possible now, presumably, to okay, we can create a plan to actually get to realizing this outcome. Can you recall what you did in order to begin to change perspectives?
I think one of the important kind of mantras we worked with at the time was, if you set a goal that is 50%, then you can decide in the business which side of the 50% you're on. But if you set a 100% goal, then there's no unclarity around where you sit. So I think that kind of clarity of direction and vision was extremely important at the time. And there's no, a lot of credit needs to go to Steve Howard, who was the chief sustainability officer at the time, and really driving that perspective and sitting in the management team or the group management team and driving that perspective. Then I think the planning, all of the work of the people who are into the business and who are responsible for, taking those conversations with the different forest owners, having those discussions in the supply chain function. I mean, they're the real heroes in this work. And I think once you have the direction and you're able to build momentum and show, some proof points, okay, this is possible here. And this was the hardest place to do. We managed to do it there, or these are some low hanging fruit that we were able to harvest. And that creates a sense of momentum that then builds and builds.
That's super interesting. It's, the build the case, build the momentum, and people will follow, and you'll turn those non-believers into essentially believers as time goes on. I've obviously massively simplified what you just described from my own.
But I can give you another example actually from VELUX where I was leading sustainability, and that's for those that don't know, it manufactures roof windows, and it's many of those are on the roofs of European and buildings in particular. And the goal there was actually to halve climate emissions by 2030. So over a short, 10-year time period to actually halve emissions right away across the value chain, whilst having growth ambitions. So it's an extremely challenging target. And then, you're faced with a target like that, and you need to work with the big emission sources. So the aluminium in the products, the steel, the glass, of course, you need to decarbonize those materials in the products. At the same time, there are the windows at the time were coming in, styrofoam in the packaging and plastic wrap, and that's what the installers were opening on site, and having to deal with these, the plastic, and having a very visual sign of unsustainability, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So the decision then was let's move on the plastic topic, even though it was a minimal impact on the climate footprint. But doing that and saying, and again, it was to say, well, this is not possible. This is going to drive costs. In the end, it was a cheaper solution. It was a better solution. And it, VELUX have successfully removed plastic from their packaging now, and gone to a fully cardboard solution. And while it didn't have the biggest impact from a climate perspective, the impact internally to say we came together across the different teams to make this happen, and we did it, that sense of momentum and that experience of collaborating together was enormous for the bigger picture. So I think those type of examples where you show, let's get going, let's make a example, let's work together and achieve something, even if it's the smaller things, I think extremely important.
That's such a brilliant example, and I couldn't agree more. It's let's win the hearts and the minds of everybody and show that there is a pathway to this, and picking on initiatives that are highly visible, perhaps highly topical, the popular areas, if you like, is a great way to do that. I that's such a brilliant insight, Jamie. And
I would say also, the hearts and minds, but also as we talked about before, companies are made up of more or less siloed functions.
Mm-hmm.
But when you work with sustainability, you need to work across. So to remove plastic from packaging, you need to work with, manufacturing, you need to work with product design, you need to work with marketing, sales. You need to work with all of these different functions, and then they need to work together. So, having they're flexing that muscle of being able to come together around this topic and work out how to collaborate is extremely important in itself.
what a brilliant recipe for sort of early stage initiatives to take on. Out of interest, Jamie, with your work with Generation 1, how much of that thinking around kind of bringing organizations, bringing your clients on that journey, how much of that is factored into the work that you do at the moment?
Yeah, it's critical because we just started talking a little bit around, the fashion sector where you have brands purchasing from manufacturers, and there's often quite a low level of trust actually between those different parties. And there's been, many years of, cost reductions, and there's often a situation where, despite having a longer term relationship with manufacturers, it's still based on orders rather than contracts. And so there's, and to solve, and now we're in a situation where the brands have set their climate targets and they're fully dependent on the manufacturers to be able to deliver on their climate goals. So there needs to be another way of working together. But it's coming from a level of rather low trust. And so the idea with Generation 1 is also to be an intermediary and a strategic partner in this, where you're able to create these opportunities for collaboration, where in the end, the benefits, they will be mutually beneficial. And there are a number of barriers to overcome. One of them is the trust and the orchestration part. And the other around, I mentioned on getting the finance to the right place and the technical resources to the right place. But without that collaboration across the value chain, it's really hard to have an impact at a bigger scale.
Which brings us on perfectly onto the article. So that's brilliantly segued, Jamie. But it's fascinating. You're almost the broker of trust between those manufacturers and brands, which is, yeah, again, fascinating to hear how you guys are operating. I should say, for any of our listeners and viewers that want to check out Generation 1, we'll link to the website so that you guys can go and dig a little deeper and find out more about exactly what Jamie's building over there, which is obviously sounds absolutely fantastic. Can we move forward with the article? Can you provide it perhaps the title and then just a brief summary as to what the piece covers?
Yeah, the article is a World Economic Forum piece and entitled "Strengthening Manufacturing Supply Chains for a New Industrial Era." And it's super interesting article. I suspect there might have been a bit of artificial intelligence involved in crafting the article, just because of the jargon bingo involved. But the content of the article was, I think, it made some really interesting points in line with what we've just been discussing, actually, where it argues for a new approaches to supply chain management, essentially. And saying that the current models, and the focus is on financing, and saying actually the current models of financing are not fit for purpose if you're trying to do a bigger transformation like digitalization or decarbonization, for example, that require systematic efforts coupled with investment. And that simply can't be met if you're working with the traditional financial tools that they're able to address kind of short-term liquidity, but not dealing with these larger scale investments. And the article, I think, rightly points out that the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, which make up a very, very large section of these manufacturing supply chains, are particularly ill-equipped to deal with these changes. They lack the capital. To do so is often a lot more expensive for these SMEs to borrow. They don't have the credit history. Particularly those located, for example, in Bangladesh, it's 17% there, cost of capital for them. So it's prohibitive for those type of companies, and they don't have the infrastructure, the resources, and the technical know-how to do it as an SME. So what the article argues for is this more programmatic approach to supply chain financing, where it's, as a purchasing company, you build a portfolio of suppliers. You can then look at different opportunities. If we take decarbonization, you say, okay, we need to, switch out these processes in these different types of suppliers, and you build an investment portfolio that can then bring in institutional investors, for example, who don't want to invest in smaller projects, but if you group them together in a portfolio, they see the opportunity there, and you can bring in new types of financing. And I think I agree with a lot of what the article kind of brought to the table. I think the equally important, it talked about programmatic supply chain finance. I think the program part is equally as important as the finance part in the description, I would say.
And just explain that in a bit more detail for us. So why is in a very sort of ill-informed view, you would think, well, look, if you can collectively bring these organizations together and then ultimately make that an attractive proposition from a finance perspective, then you've got the money to do to implement the changes that are required. Why is the programmatic element so crucial within that context?
In my experience, these, if we take, fashion supply chain, for example, the manufacturers, they have many, many priorities on their table. And, these are businesses that have been built out. They might employ 40,000 people, make 2 million T-shirts a day. And their main priority is keeping, meeting the customer needs, attracting new customers, and, meeting the needs of their workforce, keeping people employed, being a good employer. And, these are their big priorities that they have on the table. So now you're coming with another new priority, which is around decarbonising. Say now you need to change your processes that work perfectly well today, and you've operated for many years. And we need to change those to become more efficient and introduce renewable energy. They, of course, see the, climate change is real, and there are risks associated with not acting. But for it to be a priority, you need that. You need a strong customer who can then help to drive this forward and enable it to happen as part of a program. So I think the program part can, provide that structure and that kind of customer connection, but also to be able to share these different, learnings across the different suppliers that are working, and to work in that way as a program going from A to B, I think is extremely important. Otherwise, it's very hard for it to be consistently prioritized and to really get the outcomes you need to get.
And presumably, as a supplier within the supply chain that has been approached to have this programmatic sort of development, if you like, there's a sense of loyalty to the program itself, because it doesn't feel like it's a one-off initiative, or feels like something that's just been crowbarred in. It feels like some really joined up thinking has been put together that's going to convince me that, okay, I'm really part of something here. It's not just a dictated initiative that I'm having to take my attention from, as you say, the core business operation from to address in order to still be a customer. Is there a sense of that there's a degree of loyalty that's cultivated?
Yeah, I think it needs to be relevant and add value for the suppliers in the program. And of course, these companies, they meeting the needs of their customers is extremely important. So of course that's a big motivating factor. But at the end of the day, they know their businesses, they have their priorities, so it needs to add value for them to be part of this program. Beyond the just we're doing something good for the planet and for this particular customer. It needs to improve their business, I would say, and to really for them to be able to see the value of that. I think the examples given in the article were pharmaceuticals or defense, automotive, and then those are supply chains which with quite a high degree of strategic integration. So pharmaceutical suppliers, of course, they work with it very highly specialized manufacturers, producing ingredients and active ingredients for pharmaceuticals. So there's a very high kind of strategic integration in those particular supply chains where this type of approach I can see absolutely makes sense. I think a lot of people reading the article might be thinking, I can imagine a head of procurement reading the article saying this is so far from my reality that I can see theoretically that it's valuable, but it's very, very far from my reality, and that's partly because many companies don't have that degree of leverage in their supply chain. They might not even have the visibility in their supply chain. So building this type of program is hard for those companies, and that's probably the majority of companies fall into that category. I think the very large companies, ones with these strategic integration in their supply chains, can work with this. At VELUX, we run a decarbonization program with strategic partnerships for material suppliers, and we were able to run that program with often much larger companies than VELUX, so big aluminium producers, for example. And the reason they were interested in partnering with us is because they shared the same, climate ambitions, but also VELUX has quite a strong brand in the building sector. And VELUX was also able to allocate significant internal resources to drive this. It's out of the reach of many companies to do that, to say, actually, we're going to, double the size of our procurement team, potentially, to work with this type of programmatic element across our different categories. So there's some real barriers for, in terms of leverage and visibility, in terms of resourcing, and in terms of being able to finance this type of activity for many companies.
Which is why, and I love that response, which is why, Jamie, is there, one of the questions that came up for me reading the article is like, this sounds, as you say, wonderful and brilliant. And it sounds in many ways quite, an obvious thing to do in many senses, in the sense of, how do you ultimately collective improvement as opposed to sort of treating organizations as individual silos and all of the kind of implications. That is joined up thinking essentially around supply chains, isn't it? And the development of them. But whose responsibility is it to implement this? And you've touched on, you do need those kind of special circumstances of organizations of a particular size and a particular resource and a particular, coming back to, I guess, a point that we raised earlier, will and determination to want to implement this sort of program. Is it just as simple as that we just kind of need to pinpoint sector by sector who's going to be the lead? Or is there something more sophisticated that we can think about in terms of bringing on other stakeholders, the governments, the NGOs, etc., to support these kind of outcomes?
No, you're right. I think that was not clear in the article, but I think what needs to happen is that all companies need to start working with this type of mindsets and thinking. And, many companies, their climate footprint, it sits in their upstream supply chain. So a large proportion sit in their upstream supply chain. So this climate thinking and decarbonization changes the game on the level of collaboration that is needed across a value chain now, because it's no longer okay just to say, okay, well, I purchased from this company one tier up, then I'm fine. It's actually the emissions might sit lower down in the other processes. So you need to have that full value chain thinking, and you need to start working in that kind of partnership and collaborative approach. So I think the approach described in the article, I think, is maybe it's a World Economic Forum type helicopter view on things. But I think that type of approach wouldn't be accessible for many companies. But every company needs to have this mindset of collaboration and how can I have this programmatic element and to try and find ways to, away from this more transactional approach to a way of building this programmatic elements to decarbonization.
And is that part of, you've alluded to before, talking about, as I described it as the brokering of trust, if you like, and relationship between some of the manufacturers that you're working with in Bangladesh and the subcontinent, and with those brands that are purchasing from them. Is this part of the sort of objectives, if you like, of Generation One, to be that sort of that glue, that mediator, that introducer, if you like, to bring those organizations together and start implementing this kind of mindset moving forward?
Absolutely. I think there's definitely that part. And also we spent together with my founders, we spent a long time understanding the barriers to why this is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're sitting in a procurement team and you have these decarbonization goals on the table, it can feel very overwhelming to think, I need to go from here to here, and they often don't have the resources, the visibility, the capabilities to do it. So the generation one is looking to remove those barriers for those people in the brands, but also on the manufacturer's side who are facing similar questions and barriers, and try and remove those operational, technical, and financial barriers. I think that's what we need to happen in order to get the progress happening. So it is this, this element is kind of orchestrated between the different parts of the value chain, but also avoiding the need to build big internal teams, to resource things in a certain way, and to make it easy for the manufacturers to go through this process without, removing some of these high upfront costs, and connecting them with their brands and their customers during the process. So we try and remove all of those barriers as much as possible as part of the decarbonization as a service.
It's fascinating, and presumably offer that sort of aspirational element of what could be if we manage to achieve these kind of outcomes collectively across the supply chain. Well, let me ask you, Jamie, on the basis of, and I appreciate that the article and I'm so pleased you picked up on the AI element, because I have to admit, I was reading through it and I was like, I might be getting overly sensitive here, but this thing sounds like a lot like it's been wordsmithed in that way. But if we're saying that it's got that kind of fairly idealistic, optimistic, perhaps not particularly pragmatic view of the lived experience of procurement directors out there, are there any sectors around the world that you think have managed to implement a degree of this thinking, this programmatic thinking around perhaps financing and other, particularly well? Or is this something that no one's got particularly right at this stage?
Yeah, I think there are some examples out there of, sectors coming together around different standards. For example, I understand the jewelry sector, I'm not an expert there. The jewelry sector has been able to put in basic standards around, traceability, and they've been able to come together and create that consistency where you compare with the fashion sector, where everyone is auditing to their own code of conduct. It's very fragmented. I think the examples that I see of decarbonization efforts in supply chains that have worked well sit with large corporates. So, for example, IKEA has achieved significant reductions by having a very strong internal teams, long-term relationships with suppliers, working, they have a role called a supplier developer who works with the suppliers to, hand in hand to achieve these objectives. And they've worked systematically for years. So, and you could take other examples of, Nike, for example, who've, in Vietnam worked with the government there to set up, renewable energy policy and to build, infrastructure together, co-finance with multilateral organizations to try and decarbonize the grid. So these big players who are able to, come with these more systemic solutions all work very actively with their supply chain and have the resources to do it. So I think those are the examples that I see where, they have made progress.
And isn't that fascinating, reflecting back on your comment earlier about the younger Jamie sort of not perhaps I'm going to put words in your mouth here. You might tell me I'm getting this completely wrong, but the sense of sort of the word that you used was perfect. But that sort of slight sensitivity, if you like, around the role that business could play in addressing some of these challenges. But then, as you've just perfectly described, actually, in terms of the will, the agility, the means to affect this kind of change, those large corporates are absolutely essential and ultimately helping to do some of the very best work around the world. Isn't it interesting that that's kind of your sort of realization, if you like, over the course of your career?
Yeah, I think we absolutely. I think unfortunately we can pinpoint the examples of where it is working well. But of course, the reality is we exist in economies that are extractive still, and the planetary indicators are heading in the wrong direction. So we need a lot more of those good examples, and we need these more systemic approaches where we can change things. And that's the driving force behind my co-founders and myself, also with Generation One, aiming to be a change in a more systemic level. At the end of the day, that's what we're aiming for.
Well, you're going to get your first hear of the show, Jamie, because I think there's an absolutely brilliant mission and vision that you've set yourself. It brings us on perfectly to asking you what you're going to do with a magic wand. Now, on the basis of your mind and your sort of capacity for things, I'm tempted to give you multiple magic wands to see what brilliance you can come up with. But I'll stick with one, and you can always be naughty and try and get the second in there. But if I was to hand you a magic wand, Jamie, you could change one thing about the way the world corporately, commercially currently works, then please do share that with us.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I would love to have a magic wand in my back pocket. I think if I'm thinking about solving the climate challenge and more specifically decarbonizing corporate supply chains, which is a big chunk of what we need to do. There, as I mentioned before, I see it as like an orchestration problem. There is money available. There are good business cases there. So things are not moving because people are operating in the way that they have done. They're incentivized in a certain way. It's hard to add in a big transformation onto an industry or a supply chain without finding different ways to work and collaborate and, across that value chain. So I think if I had the magic wand that I could wave, it would be to enable, the key decision makers across these different value chains to be able to step outside their current reality and way of thinking and see the opportunity of collaborating in a different way and see these different opportunities for what they are. And that you can do this, if you act individually, of course you will load on cost to your particular organization. But if you think of other ways to work, other types of collaboration, then you can solve this without driving excessive costs. And, on the flip side, you can achieve savings by doing it. And I think without the magic wand, we need more organizations like Generation One who are trying to find new ways to do this. But I think that's what I would use that piece of magic for.
Jamie, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's show. It's been an absolute thrill to have you on. Thank you for giving up some of your time.
Thank you so much, Charles. I've really enjoyed the conversation and had a chance to discuss these issues with you. It's been great.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Jamie Rusby for joining me on today's show. This episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trust for communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.